Hello, dear friend. Welcome back to Books and More, your quiet corner where we distill the profound wisdom of great books into meaningful insights. Our mission is to honor your precious time while ensuring you never lose the core heartbeat of the values and lessons that matter most. Lately, the world feels like it is shifting beneath our feet, does it not? We work hard, we save, and we dream. Yet there are invisible tides constantly tugging at the value of everything we hold dear. Today, we invite you to step into the hidden battlefield of global finance with James Rickards' thought-provoking work, Currency Wars. This is a journey into a silent conflict where the weapons are not made of steel, but of paper, digital codes, and the very trust we place in our banknotes. Have you ever stopped to wonder why the money you have earned with your own hands seems to lose its breath as the years pass? What if the stability we take for granted is actually a delicate dance on the edge of a great transformation? And most importantly, how can we remain centered when the very foundations of the global system begin to tremble? Understanding these vast forces can feel overwhelming, but remember, you are not walking this path alone. Knowledge is the lantern that turns fear into clarity and uncertainty into an opportunity for growth. By looking deeply into the mechanics of our world, we gain the peace of mind to navigate the storms and protect the lives we are building. I wish you a journey filled with new perspectives and a quiet sense of empowerment. Let us begin this journey together into the heart of Currency Wars. Currency Wars, a foreword. On a quiet Sunday in August 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television to announce a new economic policy that would change the world forever. The government was imposing price controls, high import taxes, and a ban on using dollars to buy gold. The nation was in a state of crisis, a victim of an ongoing currency war that had shattered confidence in the American dollar. Nixon decided that extreme measures were necessary to save the economy. Today, I believe we are witnessing a new currency war, and a similar crisis of confidence is unfolding before us. However, the consequences this time will be much more severe. Decades of globalization, derivatives, and financial leverage have created a level of chaos that is now nearly impossible to contain. This new collapse will likely begin in the currency markets before spreading rapidly to stocks, bonds, and commodities. When the dollar falls, every market priced in that currency will fall with it, sending shockwaves across the globe. I can foresee a time when an American president will have to announce a radical intervention to prevent a total collapse. This plan might involve a return to the gold standard. If that happens, gold prices would have to be pushed significantly higher to support the massive money supply, and Americans who invested in gold might face astronomical taxes in the name of fairness. Alternatively, the president could choose to avoid gold and instead implement capital controls and a new global currency issued by the International Monetary Fund. While life would continue, the international monetary system would be unrecognizable. These are not mere exaggerations. History is full of examples where paper currencies failed, assets were frozen, and gold was confiscated. The United States is not immune to these shifts. In fact, the Federal Reserve is currently engaged in the greatest gamble in financial history. Since 2007, the Fed has fought to prevent an economic breakdown by cutting interest rates to zero. When they ran out of conventional options, they turned to quantitative easing, which is essentially a program of printing money to force growth. They are playing a high-stakes game of tug-of-war against deflation. In this struggle, the dollar is the rope, bearing the tension of opposing forces and spreading that pressure worldwide. The Fed is trying to inflate asset prices to offset the natural deflation that comes with a recession. But there is a real danger that this could lead to hyperinflation or massive bubbles in real estate and land. These bubbles are prone to bursting, much like the tech crash of 2000 or the housing crisis of 2007. Furthermore, the Fed's actions do not happen in isolation. Their decisions have a global impact. Printing more dollars leads to higher inflation in China, rising food prices in Egypt, and stock bubbles in Brazil. By devaluing the dollar, the United States is exporting its problems to other nations, and foreign governments are already fighting back. High-ranking military officials now recognize that our national security depends on the dollar remaining the world-dominant currency. If the dollar falls, American national security falls with it. In this book, I explore these issues through economic policy and history to explain why this currency war is the most significant struggle in the world today. It determines the outcome of all other struggles. Part 1. War Games. I stood in the parking lot of the Applied Physics Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland, on a rainy morning in early 2009. Around me were rows of high-powered motorcycles, a clear sign that the physicists and weapons designers who worked here had a taste for intensity. Since 1942, this facility had been the birthplace of secret weapons, from the proximity fuse of the Second World War to the Tomahawk cruise missile. But on this day, we weren't there to discuss explosives or satellites. We were there for a first-of-its-kind war game, where the weapons wouldn't be bullets or bombs, but currencies, stocks, and bonds. The Pentagon had finally realized that while the United States remained an unrivaled military power, our financial systems were vulnerable. I had been working with the military and intelligence communities since 2006, helping them understand market intelligence, or what we call market. My role was to fill a glaring gap. The room was filled with brilliant analysts, generals, and academics, but almost none of them had real-world experience on the floor of a trading room or the deck of a hedge fund. I was there to bring the cold, calculated aggression of Wall Street into the simulation. We spent months designing the rules and the teams. We decided on 5 major players: the United States, Russia, China, a Pacific Rim team representing nations like Japan and South Korea, and a gray team representing the IMF and private capital. I wanted to make sure the game didn't just follow standard academic theories. I knew that in a real financial war, an enemy wouldn't just sell treasury bonds. They would use derivatives, spread rumors, and attack the dollar's credibility itself. I was assigned to Team China, while my friend Steve Halliwell, a veteran of the Russian markets, led Team Russia. Another colleague, Bill O'Donnell, joined the gray team. Before the game started, Steve and I met for dinner in Connecticut to hatch a plan. We wanted to give the Pentagon a wake-up call. We decided that Russia would make a move so bold it would stun the referees. They would announce a new currency, backed by gold, held in neutral vaults in Switzerland, and demand it as payment for their energy exports. When the game began, we were led into the Warfare Analysis Laboratory. It looked exactly like the nuclear war rooms from Cold War films, with massive screens and individual battle stations for nearly 100 participants. The first scenario involved a complex energy deal between Russia and Japan. True to our plan, Steve stood at the podium and announced that Russia would no longer accept dollars. They were launching a gold-backed currency. The reaction was immediate and telling. The white team, the referees who controlled the game, were baffled. They initially tried to rule the move illegal, as if there were a Geneva Convention for financial markets. I had to step in and remind them that there are no rules in a currency war. Eventually, they allowed it, but labeled it not recommended. They couldn't yet see that the dollar's supremacy was a matter of trust, not a law of nature. In the second round, the scenario shifted to a crisis in North Korea. My teammates on the China team were risk-averse academics from Harvard and Rand. They wanted to stick to traditional diplomacy, but I saw an opportunity to tighten the noose. I suggested we sell our gold reserves to Russia. By doing this, we weren't just helping Russia build their new currency, we were signaling to the world that we were moving away from the dollar. My teammates were skeptical, but they eventually agreed. When the move was announced, it sent shockwaves through the simulation. Russia's PowerPoints climbed, while the US team struggled to respond. The second day of the game brought an eerie sense of reality. As I checked the news on my way to the lab, I saw that Vladimir Putin had made a public statement calling for an end to the dollar's monopoly, suggesting a currency backed by hard assets. It was exactly what we had simulated the day before. This intersection of the game and the real world added a layer of gravity to the final sessions. The last scenario focused on tensions in Taiwan and a surge of counterfeit currency. Bill O'Donnell's gray team announced that Japanese authorities had intercepted supernotes, perfectly forged $100 bills produced by North Korea. This wasn't just a hypothetical threat, it was a reminder of how easily faith in a physical currency can be undermined. By the end of the 2 days, the results were clear. The US had lost significant standing, while China and Russia had gained influence through their unconventional financial maneuvers. As we wrapped up, the lesson for the Pentagon was profound. The United States had for too long assumed that the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency was permanent. We saw that even if the dollar were devalued, our ultimate defense lay in the massive gold reserves we held in places like Fort Knox and West Point. The link between national prosperity and national security had never been clearer. The war game was a glimpse into a future where our greatest battles might not be fought on a traditional battlefield, but in the heart of the global financial system. We left Laurel knowing that the era of simple currency management was over, and the era of currency warfare had begun. Part 2. The Golden Age and the First Great Conflict. Currency wars are not merely academic exercises in exchange rate theory. They are high-stakes battles for economic survival. When I look back at the history of modern finance, it is clear that these conflicts arise from a fundamental sense of desperation. When a country's internal growth stalls, when its citizens stop spending and its government is buried in debt, the leadership often turns to the only lever left, devaluing their currency. By making their money cheaper, they hope to make their exports more attractive to the rest of the world, essentially stealing growth from their neighbors. It is a seductive but ultimately destructive path that we have traveled many times before. I often think about the warning issued by Brazil's finance minister, Guido Mantega, in 2010. He declared that a new international currency war had begun, and while the global elite were taken aback by his bluntness, the pressures leading to that moment had been building for years. To understand why this happens, we have to look at the basic building blocks of an economy. Growth comes from consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. When the first three fail to move the needle, a nation feels compelled to manipulate the fourth. If you can make your cars or your wine cheaper for an American or a Chinese buyer simply by changing the value of your currency, you can create jobs and boost your GDP without fixing any of your underlying structural problems. But this is a dangerous game of mirrors. If I devalue my currency to sell more to you, you might retaliate by devaluing yours to sell more back to me. This leads to a race to the bottom where no one truly wins, and the only certainty is rising inflation. We saw this play out with devastating consequences during the 20th century. Before the chaos of the world wars, there was a period we now remember as a golden age. From 1870 to 1914, the classical gold standard provided a level of global stability and trust that seems almost unimaginable today. It wasn't a system imposed by a global bureaucracy or a central bank. It was a voluntary club. Nations agreed that their paper money was worth a fixed amount of gold, and that anchor meant that exchange rates were steady, inflation was non-existent, and trade flourished in the first great era of globalization. Everything changed with the gunfire of 1914. To fund the Great War, nations abandoned gold and began printing money as fast as they could. When the war ended, they were left with a mountain of debt and a broken system. The first true currency war of the modern era began in 1921, and its first victim was Germany. The Weimar Republic faced impossible reparations under the Treaty of Versailles and chose to drown its problems in paper marks. I've studied the accounts of that time. Middle-class families watching their life savings become worthless in a matter of weeks, while others used wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. It was a total destruction of social trust. The world tried to return to gold in the 1920s, but they did it through a flawed compromise called the gold exchange standard. Instead of holding only gold, central banks started counting other strong currencies as reserves. It was a house of cards. When the Great Depression hit, the system shattered. Britain was the first to realize the game was up, abandoning gold in 1931 to gain a temporary trade advantage. America followed suit in 1933 under Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt's actions were among the most extreme in our history. He issued an executive order that effectively confiscated the gold of every American citizen, paying them a fixed price in paper dollars, and then immediately raising the price of gold. By doing this, he devalued the dollar against the one thing that still had value, hoping to jumpstart the economy. It worked for a moment, but it also exported our deflation to countries like France, which stayed on gold longer and suffered for it. By the time the major powers signed a shaky truce in 1936, the damage was done. The currency wars of the 1920s and 30s didn't lead to a lasting recovery. They led to protectionism, trade barriers, and a sense of nationalistic grievance that helped pave the way for the roar of actual cannons in 1939. The lesson from this era is a haunting one for our current moment. When we stop trusting the value of our money and start using it as a weapon of war, we risk losing far more than just our economic prosperity. We risk the very stability of our civilization. Part 3. Currency Wars 2 and 3. After the smoke cleared from the Second World War, the world entered a rare period of financial stability under the Bretton Woods system. For nearly 3 decades, the dollar was anchored to gold, and every other major currency was anchored to the dollar. It was a predictable world where exchange rates were fixed and inflation was low, but it could not last forever. The seeds of the Second Currency War were planted in the mid-60s when the United States tried to fund both a massive war in Vietnam and an ambitious social agenda at home. I often describe this as the era of guns and butter. We were spending money we did not have, and the rest of the world began to notice that the mountain of dollars we were printing was no longer backed by enough gold in our vaults. The pressure eventually turned squarely on us. By 1967, the British pound was the first to break, devaluing against the dollar and signaling that the post-war order was fracturing. Central banks around the world, led by France, started trading their excess dollars for our gold, and our national reserves began to vanish at an alarming rate. Everything changed on a Sunday evening in August 1971 when Richard Nixon took to the airwaves. He announced the end of the dollar's convertibility into gold and imposed new taxes on imports. It was a move designed to protect the American economy, but it effectively killed the Bretton Woods system and launched the world into a new era of floating exchange rates. What followed was a decade of economic pain that we now remember as stagflation. Prices were rising rapidly, yet the economy was standing still. The dollar was in a free fall until Paul Volcker took the lead at the Federal Reserve. He showed incredible courage by pushing interest rates up to 20% to break the back of inflation. He saved the dollar. But by the mid-80s, the currency had become so strong that American manufacturers were struggling to sell anything abroad. This led to the Plaza Accord in 1985, where we sat down with the other major powers in a New York hotel to intentionally devalue the dollar again. We thought we could devalue our way to prosperity, but these types of interventions usually just lead to more instability. By 1987, the cycle finally paused with the Louvre Accord, which aimed to stabilize the dollar after its long slide. The third currency war began in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. This time, the battlefield had changed completely. It was no longer just a fight between the United States and its old European allies. A new superpower had arrived in the form of China. As the American economy struggled to get off the ground after the Great Recession, the Federal Reserve turned to a controversial tool called quantitative easing. In simple terms, we were printing money on a scale never seen before in human history. By flooding the global markets with cheap dollars, we were trying to lower our interest rates and make our exports more competitive. But we were also forcing the rest of the world to deal with the consequences of our policies. Brazil's finance minister, Guido Montaga, was the first to call this what it really was. In 2010, he announced to the world that an international currency war had broken out. He saw that the flood of American dollars was pushing up the value of his own currency, the real, and making Brazilian goods too expensive for the world to buy. Meanwhile, China was engaged in its own strategy. They kept the yuan pegged to the dollar to ensure their factories stayed busy, which meant they had to print their own currency to maintain that link. This forced them to import the very inflation we were creating in Washington. The effects of this third war have reached far beyond the offices of central bankers. When the United States devalues its currency, the global price of essential commodities like oil and grain goes up. For an average person in a developing nation, this is not an abstract economic theory. It is a crisis that determines whether they can afford to eat. I believe the inflation sparked by these currency battles was a primary driver for the social unrest that erupted during the Arab Spring. When the cost of bread doubles because of currency manipulation on the other side of the world, people take to the streets. As I look at where we stand today, I see a world trapped in a dangerous race to the bottom. Every major nation is trying to steal growth from its neighbors by making its own money cheaper. The international meetings of the G20 have become more about political theater than actual cooperation. We are currently in a global standoff, where the United States continues to print money, China continues to protect its peg, and the rest of the world is caught in the crossfire. This is a high-stakes game that threatens the stability of the entire global financial system. If we do not move away from these paper money battles and find a more stable foundation, we risk a total collapse of confidence in the currencies we use every day. The lessons of history are clear, yet we seem determined to repeat the same mistakes that led to the great crashes of the past. Part 4. The G20 Solution and the Rise of State Capitalism. When the financial world began to crumble in 2008, it became clear that the old ways of managing global crises were no longer sufficient. The G7, once the exclusive club of the world's wealthiest nations, simply wasn't a big enough boat to navigate the storm. We needed a broader forum that included the emerging powers, most notably China, Brazil, and India. This realization led to the elevation of the G20 from a meeting of finance ministers to a summit of national leaders. I watched as President Bush and President Sarkozy spearheaded this shift, recognizing that a global fire required a global response. The G20 provided a platform for what Timothy Geithner called convening power, the ability to gather the right people in a room to hammer out solutions without the stifling weight of traditional bureaucracy. In those early days of the crisis, there was a genuine sense of cooperation born of shared fear. The G20 focused on rebalancing the global economy. From the American perspective, this meant a world where the United States would double its exports over 5 years, while China would shift its focus from selling to the world to buying for its own citizens. It sounds perfect on paper, a neat academic exchange where everyone wins. However, as the immediate panic of 2008 faded, the spirit of unity evaporated. Countries returned to their own domestic agendas. The United States pushed for a cheaper dollar to fuel its export engine, while China resisted any significant revaluation of the yuan, fearing that a loss of export competitiveness would lead to mass unemployment and social unrest. We often look to the International Monetary Fund to act as the world's economic police, but even the IMF is limited by its own history and biases. While the G20 tried to delegate the monitoring of these rebalancing efforts to the IMF, the emerging markets remained suspicious of an institution they felt was too closely aligned with Western interests. By 2011, the grand vision of a coordinated global recovery had largely stalled. The G20 had become less of a steering committee for the world and more of a theater for the two great rivals, the United States and China, to exert pressure on one another while the smaller players watched from the sidelines. This diplomatic deadlock is occurring against the backdrop of a new era of globalization that is far more dangerous than the one we knew in the late 19th century. Today, currency has become the ultimate Achilles heel. In our interconnected world, if a nation's currency collapses, its entire economy goes with it. We are no longer just dealing with multinational corporations that have a home base and a clear national identity. We are seeing the rise of truly global entities that hide their origins to maximize profit and influence. But even more significant is the return of state capitalism, a modern version of the mercantilism that dominated the 17th century. In this new landscape, business is an extension of national power. Companies like Russia's Gazprom or China's Sinopec are not just looking for a return on investment, they are the front lines of a geopolitical struggle. Russia has mastered the art of using its energy resources as a weapon, occasionally cutting off gas supplies to Europe to extract political concessions. They have even begun to talk openly about toppling the dollar's reign as the world's primary reserve currency. To the leaders in Moscow, energy and currency are two sides of the same coin, tools to be used in a larger conflict to secure their sphere of influence. China's approach is driven by an intense need for internal stability. For the Communist Party, the primary goal is job creation to avoid the kind of social upheaval that led to the tragedy at Tiananmen Square. They use their currency peg as a fortress, keeping the yuan artificially low to ensure their factories remain the workshop of the world. They see the American policy of printing money as a direct attack on their hard-earned reserves. To them, every dollar of inflation created by the Federal Reserve is wealth being stolen from the Chinese people. This has created a global game of chicken where neither side is willing to blink, and the risks are increasing exponentially. We see the fallout of these tensions in places like Dubai, which has become the Casablanca of the 21st century, a neutral ground where spies, arms dealers, and financiers from every corner of the globe mingle and move their wealth. It is a world where gold is traded in suitcases and illicit goods flow past sanctions with ease. This environment is the natural result of a system where trust in paper money is breaking down. As the major powers continue to use their currencies as weapons of war, the very foundations of the international monetary system are being undermined. We are moving toward a future that is darker and more fragmented, where the cooperative dreams of the G20 are being replaced by the cold calculations of state power and the looming threat of a total financial collapse. Part 5. Economics and the Endgame. I have spent much of my career observing the inner workings of the financial world, and it has become painfully obvious that the kings of modern economics are walking among us without any clothes. For over half a century, the academic elite and central bankers have tried to turn the messy reality of human life into a series of predictable mathematical equations. They separated economics from its roots in political science and philosophy, wedding it instead to the rigid laws of physics. But as I watched the 2008 crisis unfold, I realized that these models were not just wrong, they were dangerous. Mainstream thinkers failed to predict the collapse because they relied on concepts like the money multiplier and the velocity of money as if they were constants. In reality, these are psychological factors driven by human fear and confidence. When the Federal Reserve tries to jumpstart a stalled economy by printing trillions of dollars, they are essentially conducting a massive experiment on the American public without a clear map of the consequences. I believe the Fed has failed in its most basic duties, presiding over a currency that has lost almost all of its purchasing power since its inception. To find a better way forward, I turned to complexity theory and behavioral science. I began to view our global markets not as efficient machines, but as complex, self-organizing systems that behave more like the weather or tectonic plates. In a system this large and interconnected, risk does not follow a neat bell curve where extreme events are impossible. Instead, we live in a world of power laws, where catastrophic events are actually much more common than the experts suggest. I often use the analogy of an avalanche. The collapse is not caused by the last snowflake that falls, it is caused by the unstable state of the snowpack on the mountain. Our mountain of debt and derivatives is now so massive and so interconnected that the risks have grown exponentially. The tools used by Wall Street to manage this risk are fundamentally flawed because they assume the future will be a mirror image of a peaceful past. They bury systemic dangers behind complex formulas, convincing themselves and the regulators that everything is under control, even as the system nears a breaking point. The end game for the dollar is now approaching, and I see 4 distinct scenarios unfolding on the horizon. The first is a move toward multiple reserve currencies, where no single nation dominates. This would be a messy transition that fails to solve the underlying problems of debt and trust. The second involves the rise of the special drawing right, a global currency issued by the International Monetary Fund. This would essentially be a bureaucratic takeover of the world's money, handled in secret without accountability to any citizenry. The third path, and perhaps the only one that truly restores stability, is a return to a gold-backed system. While the elite often dismiss gold as a relic, history shows us that when paper money fails, humans instinctively return to tangible assets. I can envision a scenario where a new dollar is issued at a significantly higher gold price to stabilize the global order and prevent total collapse. The final and most terrifying possibility is social chaos. If we continue to ignore the warnings and rely on broken theories, the eventual collapse will not just be financial, but civilizational. We still have time to simplify our institutions and reduce the scale of our banks, but the window is closing and the mountain of snow is heavier than ever.